If Trump thinks pulling funding from the NEA is going to stop artists, he's got another thing coming to him. I'm back with part 2 on the NEA and a history of federal funding of the arts in the US. You see this? We have never had federal funding. Look, the green is the federal funding, and the red is state funding, the blue is local funding. I think we'll make it. But let's review why Americans historically don't want to fund the arts and how Republican presidents have slashed the NEA ever since Reagan, and how basically art is another tool that politicians use to divide us, and why that is. In the 1950s, state-funded arts and radio was viewed as communistic and undemocratic. Americans were basically terrified that their tax dollars going toward radio and arts funding was communistic. And not much has changed since. There's quite an apathy towards arts funding and a resistance towards arts funding publicly. I don't know, do you agree? Do you feel this? What do you think about this? Changed when elite billionaires like Nelson Rockefeller got together and pushed for a Ministry of Arts and Culture, and that was when the NEA was formed in 1965. So in the 60s, we got some federal funding of arts, and then this became the blueprint of state funding in each state to have an arts council. We also achieved getting public radio funded and spearheaded, and thereby we got PBS and NPR, which were also slashed this week. And so once we got this funding, the argument of how the funding should be dispersed began. So of course, if the radio isn't serving a political party, they want to do away with it. And if the arts aren't being funded the way the public wants, or it can be used as a tool to dissuade the public to vote either way, is another issue. But all of this does not address the basic apathy of the public towards arts funding. And therein lies the paradox, because it doesn't serve the politicians to keep the public educated about the arts or arts funding. It doesn't serve them to have a public that cares or wants arts. But let's go back to how the argument began after we got the funding for arts and radio. So now that all the states had their own arts councils, the NEA was sending funding to each state, and then we had some federal and some state funding for the arts. The argument about how that funding was being dispersed began. And unfortunately, we have not really progressed, even though the state arts agencies continue to send money to local art orgs and communities. So the first ideology was elite favoritism. So elitism in arts funding, meaning that major institutions and orchestras were funded, mostly in bicoastal cities. And the opposing view was that not enough funding was getting to a diverse array of artists, rural artists, folkloric artists, indigenous artists, and artists of all disciplines. So basically, we kind of have a DEI breakdown of arts funding. So the argument that why should a coal miner in West Virginia pay tax dollars for an orchestra in New York, or why should a single mother in Detroit pay for a museum in a state she doesn't live in? Basically, the challenge for legislators is to convince the average American that publicly funding the arts will improve their lives directly. So how do we do that? What do you think? Basically, we get state-funded arts and radio in the 60s, but then by the 70s, fights are breaking out about where the funding's going, where the information's going, and we start to develop a sense of divide. And this brings us to the 80s. Reagan completely cut funding to the NEA and totally decimated it. And you can see all the other administrations where the NEA has been slashed since. One thing that totally decimated musicians in the 80s under the Reagan antitrust, anti-union era was that the NLRB, or National Labor Relations Board, reduced musicians from being employees of record labels and studios down to being independent arts contractors, which basically disempowered us from unionizing and having collective bargaining agreements because it disenfranchised us and spread us apart. And that's something that should be corrected. And this brings us to the 90s, when the GOP famously weaponized art and demonized Robert Mapplethorpe's work in Congress, starting a culture war in the Senate and congressional hearings. And this shifted public opinion 2/3 for public funding before the culture wars on the Senate floor in the 90s to being opposed to public funding. 2/3 of Americans were opposed to public funding of arts after. If it's any consolation, the NEA only funds 1% of the total arts economy. And let's not forget that artists are out here doing it on their own terms, and that is where the real power is. There's the difference between public and private funding, and also self-funding. The self-funded artists are going to rule the world, in my humble opinion. So case in point, the New Jersey State Council on the Arts found this out in a series of focus groups in the 90s, where they spoke to artists around the state, and they found out that most artists didn't even know that there was a New Jersey State Council of the Arts. And secondly, if they did know, they didn't really like the New Jersey State Council of the Arts. And so think about that for a second, because on top of that, this State Arts Council exists. It's dispersing grants. The artists have to apply to the grants. That takes a lot of time to sift through the applications. It takes a lot of time for the artists to send the applications. And then they found out that the council was spending 15 times as many letters rejecting the grants than awarding grants. So it just seems like, to me personally, a waste of time. But this is the system we have. So I also think that as an artist that has just not given up on grants because I've spent 20 years applying and it's been a waste of time, and less than 5% of artists who apply for grants ever receive grants. In 20 years I applied for grants and never received anything. And anyway, it's not how my creativity works. I don't want to put a spreadsheet of how I'm going to create something and prove how much money it costs and ask for the money, and then create the thing and wait 6 months to a year to see if maybe I get the money in the shape and form and the little ways that they ask you to fill out the form and apply for the grant to make the thing. That doesn't work for me. Also, I think my punk band is a little too subversive for public funding. But that's okay. We're still making art out here by myself on my own terms. It's fine. And fun fact, I applied to the New York City Women's Fund last year for music. And gosh, that application was due November 2024. No, excuse me. It was due November 2023. And they were supposed to announce the winners in March of 2024, but they never did. And in March of 2024, they announced that they were not going to announce it until the following year, November 2024. So that would mean that I would have to wait a year to see if the idea I had would be funded. And New York doesn't sleep. And so what did I do? I made the record on my own dime and did a live performance with my band at Brooklyn Pride, and then basically a friend filmed it, and then I chopped it up and turned it into a little video, and that's the best I can do. What do you want from me? But anyway, I have ideas on how to restructure this and make a type of way to actually get funding directly to artists already performing at venues each night. All right, y'all, I'm going to leave you with some Robert Mapplethorpe just to honor the queer artists who were demonized by the GOP in the past. As a reminder, we will get through this. And I'd love to hear how you feel about public funding, private funding, and self-funding. And yeah, that's it. Like and follow for more, protect the dolls, and be well.